From the little station on Commercial Street in Atchison, Kansas, this is Chesterton Radio. Tonight we're opening the files of Scotland Yard, not merely to solve crimes, but to discover why these remarkable stories continue to fascinate generations of listeners. Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute clinical precision.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, the doctor points to it and says, there it is, that's the problem. It's clean, it's binary, and honestly, it's incredibly comforting.
It is, yeah. We have this fundamental human desire for things to be visible and just easily categorized. I mean, a broken bone is a structural failure. You cast it, it heals, you move on.
Right, but then you step into the world of criminal investigation and suddenly that x-ray machine is completely useless.
Yeah, completely.
Because you aren't dealing with bone fractures anymore. You're dealing with the human heart. You're dealing with human fallibility, desperation, and the really messy, chaotic, often deeply tragic aftermath of a crime. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, entirely murky.
That's a really good way to put it.
And that is exactly what we are exploring today in this deep dive. We are looking under the hood of a classic 1951 to 1952 NBC radio procedural called Whitehall 1212.
And what's fascinating here is that if you look at the radio landscape of the early 1950s, I mean, it was completely dominated by the fast-talking, hard-boiled detective, the lone wolf who kicked down doors and engaged in these action-packed shootouts.
Yeah, the real Pulp Fiction stuff.
Exactly. But Whitehall 1212 rejected all of that. It captured the quiet, methodical, almost bureaucratic essence of British policing. It relied entirely on intellect, careful observation, and early forensic science.
So, to you, the listener, whether you are a fellow lover of Golden Age mysteries, maybe an amateur sleuth, a devotee of Father Brown or Sherlock Holmes, or just someone fascinated by how we find objective truth in a sea of chaos, pull up a chair.
We've got a lot to get through today.
We really do. We have a massive stack of historical sources here in our Midwestern studio. We're unpacking the history of the Metropolitan Police, the grueling reality of early forensic science, and the broadcast history of classic true crime radio to figure out why Whitehall 1212 worked so incredibly well and, why it set the template for almost every procedural we consume today.
Yeah, it really is the grandfather of the genre.
So let's unpack this. To really grasp the weight of this show, we can't just start with the radio scripts, right? We have to understand the physical institution it was built upon. The address, the yard, and that iconic string of numbers.
Right, so to set the stage properly, we really have to go back to the origins of the Metropolitan Police. Because London in the early 19th century was this rapidly expanding metropolis, and its policing system was entirely localized, fragmented, and frankly, largely ineffective.
Just a mess of night watchmen, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. So in 1829, the Home Secretary, Robert Peel, founded the Metropolitan Police. He wanted a centralized professional force. And he actually drew some very interesting conceptual inspiration from Eugène-François Vidocq across the Channel in France.
Wait, Vidocq? I know that name from literary history. Wasn't he a former criminal himself?
He was, yeah. Vidocq was a former criminal who essentially invented modern plainclothes policing and the French sûreté.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, he realized that uniformed guards just standing on corners caused criminals to scatter and hide. To catch a criminal, you needed someone who understood the criminal mind, right? Someone who could blend into the environment, gather intelligence, and operate undercover.
Takes a thief to catch a thief, basically.
Exactly. And Peel observed this need for specialized detective work. So when Peel set up his new police force for London, he established the original headquarters in Westminster at a very specific private house located at 4 Whitehall Place.
Okay, here's where my geographical logic hits a brick wall. If the headquarters was at a private house at 4 Whitehall Place, how on earth did a British police force end up being known globally as Scotland Yard? I mean, they aren't in Scotland, and a yard sounds like, I don't know, a place you keep sheep.
I know, it sounds bizarre. But it all comes down to the quirks of London's urban geography and its architecture. So 4 Whitehall Place was the official address, but it had a main public entrance at the back of the building.
Okay.
And that back entrance opened onto a street called Great Scotland Yard, which historically had been the site of a residence for visiting Scottish royalty centuries earlier, hence the name.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and because the general public, the informants, and the beat cops primarily used that rear entrance to access the police station, the street name just became intimately associated with the institution itself.
So it's exactly like calling the American financial sector Wall Street. I mean,
Right.
Wall Street is just a physical, relatively narrow road in lower Manhattan, but the name represents an entire global financial institution.
Right, exactly the same principle.
Or like how we say Downing Street to mean the British executive government or the Pentagon to mean the U.S. military. It's a metonym. But still, it's fascinating how an architectural backdoor entrance became the universal, legendary symbol for detective work.
And it is a name that stuck with fierce tenacity, even as the force physically moved over the decades, because they actually outgrew that original 4 Whitehall Place site remarkably fast.
I can imagine.
Yeah, you have to remember the context of the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution was booming, London's population was exploding, and the bureaucracy of managing a city at the heart of the British Empire was staggering. By 1890, the Metropolitan Police had grown from its initial 1,000 officers to about 13,000.
Wait, 13,000 officers? Plus administrative staff, record-keeping, holding cells? They can't possibly stay in a retrofitted private house in Westminster. That sounds like a logistical nightmare.
Oh, it's impossible.
They must have had to build a massive bureaucratic center from scratch.
They did. They moved to a newly completed, very imposing red brick building on the Victoria Embankment, overlooking the River Thames. These were the Norman Shaw buildings, designed by the architect Richard Norman Shaw. But because the police force carried their famous public-facing nickname with them, this entirely new location was officially christened New Scotland Yard.
So the yard is a concept that travels with them. It's an idea, not just a physical plot of land.
Exactly, and the moves didn't stop there. In 1967, they needed even more modern facilities and consolidated into a tall utilitarian block on Broadway in Victoria.
Right.
Then, most recently, in 2016, they moved back to the Victoria Embankment, into the Curtis Green building. And following that deeply ingrained tradition, it was once again renamed New Scotland Yard.
So they literally always take the name with them. That's fantastic. But let's shift from the address to the number, because that is the literal title of our show, Whitehall 1212. Where exactly does that come from? Was it just like a catchy radio title somebody made up?
Not at all. It was the literal telephone number of the Metropolitan Police.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Before all number dialing, telephone exchanges in major cities used names. Callers would dial the first 3 letters of the exchange name followed by the digits. So if you were a citizen in London in the 1930s, 40s, or 50s, and you needed to contact the Metropolitan Police Information Room, you picked up the receiver and dialed WHI for the Whitehall Exchange, followed by 1212.
Okay, so WHI 1212.
Right. Numerically, that translated to 944-1212. And this specific number was introduced in 1932, replacing their older number, which was Victoria 7000.
I love the tactile mechanical history of that. Just imagine dialing WHI on one of those heavy black Bakelite rotary phones, the physical weight of making that call. But hold on, didn't the UK introduce the 999 emergency number right around that same time? I always thought 999 was the universal police number over there.
They did introduce 999 in 1937, making it the world's first dedicated emergency telephone number, actually.
Oh, the first in the world.
Yeah, but 999 was strictly for active life or death emergencies, a crime in progress, a severe fire, a medical crisis. Even after 999 became the standard for panic, WHI 1212 remained the primary non-emergency public switchboard for Scotland Yard all the way until the 1960s.
Okay, if we connect this to the bigger picture of what a radio show is trying to achieve, think about the psychological comfort of that specific number to post-war Londoners and to British citizens in general.
Absolutely.
I mean, if dialing 999 meant panic, chaos, and absolute disaster, dialing WHI 1212 represented order, duty, routine, and most importantly, community trust. It wasn't the "my house is on fire" number. It was the "I saw someone lingering around the shop and I want to offer a clue" number. It was the administrative heartbeat of the police.
It's a really vital distinction. It was a line of communication based on partnership between the public and the police, which is the absolute cornerstone of the British policing model, which is policing by consent.
Which makes naming the radio show Whitehall 1212 an absolute stroke of genius. It was the perfect, instantly recognizable title for a show that sold itself entirely on being an authentic, grounded police procedural. It said to the listener right out of the gate, "We aren't giving you pulp fiction. We are giving you the institution. This is the real deal."
Precisely. The phone number was the public face of Scotland Yard. It was the welcoming point of contact between the citizens and the institution. But here is the paradox. The actual stories, the source material that made the radio show so compelling, didn't come from the public information desk at all. They came from a place the public was strictly forbidden to see, the Yard's most hidden, secretive, and macabre room.
A black museum.
Yes. Today it's officially known as the Crime Museum, but for over a century it was famously, or perhaps infamously, known as the Black Museum. It is situated deep in the basement of New Scotland Yard.
Okay.
And the origins of this room go way back to 1874, conceived by an inspector named Percy George Name.
Okay, I have to challenge this a bit, though. How does a professional police department end up running what sounds like a Victorian freak show, a museum of murder weapons? I mean, it sounds like something a sensationalist carnival barker would put together, not a serious government institution.
It does sound really counterintuitive today, I agree, but it actually grew out of a very practical piece of legislation called the Forfeiture Act of 1870.
What did that do?
Well, before this act, the property of convicted felons was often forfeit to the Crown, or just dealt with inconsistently. The new act allowed the police to legally retain prisoners' property, specifically for instructional and historical purposes, rather than destroying it or returning it to the criminal's associates.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So Inspector Name, recognizing the value of these physical objects, teamed up with a police constable named Randall. They started gathering items, and initially they were very practical things like the specialized lockpicking tools found on burglars or the jimmies used by safecrackers. By 1875, it had evolved into an official, albeit strictly private, museum within the Yard.
And we really need to emphasize this point for you listening. The Black Museum was never meant for the public. This wasn't a tourist trap. It wasn't designed to sell tickets or thrill true crime junkies looking for a weekend diversion.
No, not at all. Its mission was purely, rigorously educational. It was a teaching collection for police recruits. It was a classroom by studying the physical artifacts of past crimes. By actually holding the tools of the trade young detectives could learn how to detect, analyze, and prevent future crimes.
So take us down into the basement. What is actually inside this room? Set the scene for the listener.
According to our historical sources, the current iteration of the museum is maintained as a dark, highly secure room in the basement of the Curtis Green building. Crucially, it is kept at a constant temperature of 17 degrees Celsius, which is about 63 degrees Fahrenheit.
Why that specific temperature? Is it just for comfort?
No, it's to halt the degradation of biological and organic materials.
Yeah.
You have to remember, they are storing leather straps, wooden handles soaked in dried blood, old paper documents, and clothing. If the room gets too warm or humid, these critical historical artifacts would just rot or mold. At 17 degrees, it preserves the evidence indefinitely.
Wow.
It currently holds over 500 major exhibits, and the range of items is astonishing in its grimness. You have a massive collection of melee weapons, particularly concealed ones. Walking stick swords, shotguns cleverly disguised as umbrellas, knives hidden in belt buckles.
I read in the sources that they even have a collection of hangman's nooses.
They do, yeah, carefully cataloged.
Yeah.
This includes the actual noose used to perform the United Kingdom's last ever execution before capital punishment was abolished.
That is wild.
They also have plaster death masks made for criminals executed at Newgate Prison, which the police acquired when the prison permanently closed its doors in 1902. They hold the intricate poisons kit of Thomas Neal Cream, the notorious Lambeth poisoner who terrorized London in the late 19th century. They even have the fake De Beers diamond from the attempted Millennium Dome heist in 2000.
And they have items from incredibly infamous, world-renowned cases, right? Not just run-of-the-mill burglars.
Exactly. They have the personal belongings of the prolific 19th century burglar and murderer Charlie Peace. They hold letters allegedly written by Jack the Ripper, taunting the police.
Chilling.
And to bring it into the Cold War era, they have the microscopic ricin-filled pellet that was used to assassinate the Bulgarian dissident Georgy Markov on Waterloo Bridge in 1978, complete with a model of the umbrella used to silently fire it into his leg.
It is an incredibly macabre collection. I mean, you have Dennis Nelson's actual stove and bathtub. You have the revolver Ruth Ellis used to murder her lover in 1955. It is the physical accumulation of some of the darkest, most tragic moments in British criminal history, all cataloged, tagged with case numbers, and preserved in a sterile environment at exactly 17 degrees.
It is deeply unsettling when you really stop and consider what those objects represent.
Well, there is a profound philosophical irony here. Just think about the space. You have this basement room filled from floor to ceiling entirely with the tools of chaos, malice, greed, and human fallibility. It is a repository of humanity at its absolute worst. And yet, this exact room is used to forge order, discipline, and quiet professionalism in the young recruits who study there. It's like taking a deadly virus and synthesizing a vaccine from it. I have to wonder, is this why the radio show Whitehall 1212 felt so incredibly grounded? Because it was rooted in a classroom dedicated to truth, rather than a theater dedicated to entertainment.
That's a brilliant insight, and I think it hits the very core of why the show resonated. The show felt authentic because its source material wasn't generated in a smoke-filled writer's room by screenwriters looking for cheap thrills and sensationalism. It was generated in an environment dedicated to rigorous, methodical academic study of human behavior.
But taking that private, clinical police classroom and turning it into a compelling radio drama for the American airwaves, that is a massive leap.
Oh, huge.
That required some serious creative alchemy. And that transatlantic partnership brings us to the architects of the airwaves, an American radio pioneer named Wyllis Cooper and a British reporter named Percy Hoskins.
Wyllis Cooper is a fascinating, somewhat underappreciated figure in early radio. He was a true pioneer of radio drama, primarily known for creating the legendary horror and mystery anthology Quiet Please.
Right.
During World War II, he also served as a consultant to the U.S. Secretary of War and produced the Army Hour for the government, which was a highly influential news and variety propaganda series designed to essentially boost morale.
I love this eccentric detail from the sources about Cooper, though. He actually changed the spelling of his first name from Wyllis with an I to Wyllis with a Y simply to please his wife's deep interest in numerology.
It's a great detail.
It really shows a quirky, open-minded personality. But when it came to his professional craft of radio production, the guy was an absolute master of understatement.
He was. If we connect this to the broader evolution of audio storytelling, Cooper understood a fundamental psychological truth about the medium, which is that what the listener imagines in their own mind is far more terrifying and far more engaging than explicit horror.
Let the audience do the work.
Exactly. He knew that the sound of a creaking door, the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock, or a quiet, mundane conversation, abruptly interrupted by silence, creates infinitely more tension than just broadcasting a loud theatrical scream.
He respected the audience's intelligence and their imagination. But for Whitehall 1212, which debuted on NBC in the U.S. on November 18, 1951, Cooper knew that clever sound design wasn't enough. He needed authenticity. He needed the real, gritty details of actual police work to ground his understated style. That's where Percy Hoskins came in.
Percy Hoskins was a towering figure in British journalism at the time. He was the legendary chief crime reporter for the London Daily Express.
Okay.
And because of his beat, he was intimately familiar with the inner workings of Scotland Yard, the detectives, and the contents of the Black Museum. Hoskins served as the bridge, providing the meticulous research, the case files, and the narrative storylines for the show.
And the pitch for this show was incredibly bold, especially for the 1950s. The introduction to the show explicitly claimed to the audience, for the first time in history, Scotland Yard opens its secret files.
Which was a massive deal.
They actually secured official permission from the sitting commissioner of Scotland Yard at the time, Sir Harold Scott. They featured an all-British cast recording in London to ensure the accents, the vernacular, and the cultural tone were completely flawless.
And most importantly, they claimed to be presenting the unvarnished facts just as they occurred. The only thing they changed were the names of the participants to protect the innocent and the families of the victims. They made a deliberate choice not to sensationalize. Their stated goal was to document.
Okay, we have to be a little critical here, though. They claim unvarnished facts, and the commissioner himself signed off on it. If the top boss of Scotland Yard is giving you access to the files, he's expecting good PR. Was this just a form of 1950s propaganda, a way to broadcast a reassuring message to the public that said, don't worry, the police state is infallible and we always catch the bad guy?
This raises a really important historical question, and it's something media historians frequently debate when looking at procedurals of this era. Yes, it certainly served a restorative function for a traumatized post-war society, providing reassurance.
All right.
But what makes Whitehall 1212 unique and what elevates it above mere propaganda is that it didn't portray the police as infallible superheroes. It portrayed them as tired, overworked civil servants.
Oh, that's interesting.
In the scripts, the police make mistakes, they hit frustrating dead ends, they deal with mind-numbing paperwork. The reassurance it offered came from their dogged persistence, not their perfection.
That makes a lot of sense. Think about the era. The airwaves and newsstands were absolutely flooded with sensationalized pulp fiction, hard-boiled private eyes, constant Tommy gun shootouts, exaggerated, twirling mustache villains. And here comes Whitehall 1212, selling itself entirely on restraint, bureaucratic truth, and the slow grind of justice. It was a massive departure from the norm.
It was a huge risk for a network, honestly. But it paid off because that gritty authenticity resonated deeply with listeners. However, Whitehall 1212 wasn't the only show attempting to mine Scotland Yard's basement for radio gold at that exact same time. And this leads to one of the most fascinating contrasts in storytelling philosophy in radio history.
Ah, yes, the rival broadcast. This is where the media history gets really juicy. Two shows pulling from the exact same source material, the Black Museum, but delivering completely different vibes.
Exactly. While NBC was broadcasting Wyllis Cooper's Whitehall 1212, the Mutual Network was broadcasting a heavily syndicated show produced by Harry Alan Towers, simply titled The Black Museum. It aired in the U.S. in 1952 and later gained a massive audience in Europe on Radio Luxembourg.
And the Black Museum has some serious, undeniable star power behind the microphone. It was hosted by none other than Orson Welles.
Welles brought his full theatrical weight to the project. He would open the show with the iconic booming chimes of Big Ben. He would narrate a slow, atmospheric walk through the museum, pick up a specific object, perhaps a woman's shoe, a tiny white pillbox, or a quilted robe, and launch into a highly dramatized, deeply macabre tale.
And the tone was radically different. Welles' delivery was theatrical, wry, and perfectly suited to a psychological thriller. But the biggest difference wasn't just the host, it was the narrative structure.
Right.
The Black Museum frequently showed the crime from the criminal's point of view. It placed the listener inside the mind of the murderer. It played out the tense, grisly scenes of the actual murders as they happened. It was fundamentally about the psychological descent into evil.
And Whitehall 1212 explicitly and proudly rejected that approach. It was hosted by Chief Superintendent John Davidson, who was presented as the fictional, authoritative curator of the museum. The show actively pushed back against the picturesque tropes of pulp fiction. In one specific episode, the superintendent literally states to the audience that they don't do high adventure in Limehouse or sinister Orientals. They're simply professional policemen, catchers of criminals.
So Whitehall 1212 started at the crime scene. After the chaos had already happened, the blood is already dry. And it moved forward strictly from the point of view of the police. It was about the methodical restoration of justice. The Black Museum was a psychological thriller, while Whitehall 1212 was a procedural.
If we look at this through the lens of modern media consumption, the Black Museum is the direct ancestor of the modern true crime thriller. The podcasts and documentaries that focus heavily on the serial killer's mind, their childhood trauma, and the grisly details of the act itself.
While Whitehall 1212 is the grandfather of the pure police procedural, it's the spiritual ancestor of shows like Dragnet or even Law & Order or any investigative podcast where the focus is on the steady, step-by-step gathering of forensic evidence. It's about the system working, not the system breaking.
And to truly understand this unvarnished procedural approach, to see how they executed this vision, we need to dive deep into the actual case files that Wyllis Cooper and Percy Hoskins chose to broadcast. We need to look at how they constructed these mysteries.
Okay, listener, consider this a brief, cozy spoiler warning. We are about to unpack the granular details of some 70-year-old mysteries that were broadcast over half a century ago. If you want to go listen to the original broadcast, completely blind, which I highly recommend, hit pause, go explore the archives, and come back. But if you're ready to look at the evidence with us, let's step into the Black Museum. Let's examine case number 1, the Blitz murder case. File 302 Miller's 650.
This case is a perfect example of how the show brilliantly utilized historical context to elevate a standard murder investigation. The episode takes place 16 months after the devastating Easter Blitz of 1941, right in the thick of World War II. Workers are tasked with clearing out the bombed-out ruins of a Baptist chapel in London. It's a scene of utter destruction. A police constable, John Dunn, is called to the scene because under a heavy stone slab deep in a burial vault that had been cracked open by the bombing, the workers have found a human skeleton.
Now, wait a minute. Securing a crime scene in a pristine suburban home is one thing, but securing a crime scene in a bombed-out church with unstable rubble, dust everywhere, and wartime chaos, that sounds nearly impossible.
It's incredibly difficult.
But Chief Inspector Bryce Purcell takes the lead, and they don't use magic. They use methodical police work. Through missing persons reports and dental records, they identify the victim as a Mrs. Hope Russell. And here is the narrative twist. She was reported missing by her husband, Stanley Russell, a completely unremarkable shop clerk.
Right.
And he reported her missing the day before Good Friday, which is crucial because that was right before the bombs fell and destroyed the chapel. And now, 16 months later, Stanley Russell is also mysteriously missing.
What's fascinating here is how the macro-level chaos of Hitler's Luftwaffe provides the perfect cover for a micro-level, intimate domestic murder. The show contrasts the massive historical scale of the global war with the small, petty, greedy reality of a husband murdering his wife.
It perfectly illustrates a theme deeply loved by the great mystery writer G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton often wrote about the idea of evil hidden within ordinary life. You have this massive national tragedy, sirens wailing, bombs raining down from the sky, entire city blocks leveled, and a mundane, boring shop clerk uses that apocalyptic chaos to hide his own personal sin.
Yeah, he takes advantage of it.
He figures, who is going to look for one missing woman when thousands are dying? It's a chilling reminder that the worst monsters aren't always supervillains. They're often just ordinary, selfish people taking advantage of a terrible situation.
And the way the police solve it is a testament to the procedural format. They don't solve it with a sudden flash of brilliant Sherlock Holmes-style intuition. They solve it through footwork.
Right, because how did they find Stanley Russell 16 months later in a country at war? They didn't have computer databases.
Exactly. They talked to the local greengrocer, they tracked down his old postman, they checked employment records at local factories, they sifted through thousands of ration book registries.
Wow.
They finally locate him because he slipped up on a mundane bureaucratic detail, using a ration book in a different district under an assumed name, but with a signature that matched his old life. It's a web of mundane inquiries that finally traps him.
Which brings us to our second case, which highlights the mundane, physical nature of these investigations even more profoundly. Let's look at the indestructible tooth. Case 2011, Mem R 340.
The synopsis of this case is incredibly straightforward, almost deceptively simple. A local builder named Sidney Patterson goes missing. He just vanishes. Inspector Edmund Whitaker is assigned to investigate what looks like a routine missing persons case.
When the fictional curator, Chief Superintendent Davidson, introduces this episode and shows us the exhibits for this case in the Black Museum, it is almost laughably mundane. I mean, the listener is expecting a bloody axe, a smoking revolver, or a vial of exotic poison. Instead, the exhibit consists of two items: a single human tooth and the badly charred top of an ordinary wooden office stool.
But those two mundane, seemingly insignificant objects are all it takes to completely unravel a murder and send a man to the gallows. The forensic reality the police relied on is that it is incredibly difficult to completely destroy a human body, particularly the teeth.
Right.
Fire might consume flesh and bone, but dental enamel is incredibly resilient.
The show makes this chilling, profound observation right in the script. A murdered person's teeth are almost impossible to destroy. Wait, let me rephrase that. A murdered person's teeth are almost impossible to destroy. Nothing is ever lost and will certainly be found sometime, somewhere, by someone.
It's a powerful moral theme that echoes throughout the entire series. It speaks to human fallibility and arrogance. Criminals often believe they are clever enough to erase their beads, to outsmart the system, to cheat the universe of its consequences. They build a massive fire, they burn the evidence, they walk away thinking they are free.
But they aren't.
But the universe, and by extension, the methodical men of Scotland Yard, is patient. A single tooth survives the intense heat of the fire. A charred piece of wood remains unburned because it was shielded by the very body it was used to bludgeon.
It's the ultimate hubris of the criminal versus the relentless, unforgiving patience of the physical world. You cannot burn away the truth. The physical world holds on to it. And speaking of the grim, unforgiving reality of crime, let's look at Case 3, the Limehouse Illusion, Case 604 Millar 530.
In this episode, Superintendent Alistair Watkins is tasked with investigating the murder of a man named Albert Stevens. Now, Stevens wasn't an innocent civilian. He was a known police informant, what the underworld called a copper narc. The suspects in this case are not criminal masterminds. They are ordinary, desperate people living on the margins of society. Leo Stefanovich, a Polish Navy deserter hiding out in London, and a local woman named Marion Ketke.
And the exhibit in the Black Museum for this specific case, it's even less impressive than a tooth. It's just a bullet, a deformed piece of lead. The bullet that ended Albert Stevens' life. Nothing flashy, nothing exotic.
The police use painstaking ballistic analysis and street-level informants of their own to track down Stefanovich and Ketke. The suspects are cornered, tried, found guilty, and sentenced to hang. The show, remaining true to its unvarnished promise, doesn't shy away from the grim reality of the gallows. There's no triumphant music at the end, just the heavy realization of lives wasted.
But this case is particularly fascinating to me because of its explicit meta-commentary. Right at the beginning of the broadcast, the superintendent essentially breaks the fourth wall. He
Hmm.
tells the audience to throw out all their Pulp Fiction expectations. He says, look, we aren't chasing criminal masterminds in fog-shrouded opium dens. There are no exotic villains in silk robes lurking in the shadows. It's just a tragic, grubby little murder of an informant committed by frightened, desperate people.
It completely demystifies the detective genre. It tells the listener that real police work is often grim, ordinary, and deeply sad. It strips away the romance of crime. It culminates in the stark, real-life consequences of the death penalty. It's about institutional accountability, not escapist entertainment.
So what does this all mean when we put these cases together? In all these scenarios, from tracing a shop clerk after the Blitz to analyzing a charred stool to hunting down a deserter who shot an informant, the police never, ever rely on sudden bursts of genius.
No, never.
They don't sit in an armchair smoking a pipe until the answer magically appears to them. They rely on rigorous, boots-on-the-ground, painstaking forensic science and procedure. Which brings us to the core of the show, how they actually did it. Let's look at the real investigative science they used in a completely pre-digital world.
To understand the investigative methods portrayed in Whitehall 1212, we have to understand the rigid protocols of a crime scene, which were becoming highly standardized by the mid-20th century. The absolute very first step, which is critical to everything that follows, is securing the scene to avoid any biological or physical contamination.
Like PC John Dunn finding the skeleton in the bombed-out chapel in the Blitz case, the first thing he did was set a perimeter before the chief inspector even arrived. But I have to ask, is this just radio making the police look incredibly professional? Were 1950s beat cops really that disciplined about crime scenes?
It's a fair question. Obviously, mistakes happened, and human error is always a factor. But by the 1940s and 50s, Scotland Yard had heavily institutionalized these protocols. According to our historical sources on crime scene management, immediately after discovery, law enforcement was strictly trained to set up physical barriers, often literally just ropes and barricade tape, to control movement in and out. The initial responding officer is solely responsible for this. They must document the scene's initial condition, note the weather, note who is present, and aggressively ensure that no one eats, drinks, or smokes anywhere near the evidence.
I always laugh when I read about the history of crime scenes because back in the 1890s, Arthur Conan Doyle was writing Sherlock Holmes complaining bitterly about the police acting like a herd of buffalo, trampling all over his pristine crime scenes and ruining the footprints. Holmes was obsessed with maintaining the integrity of the scene. And it took a few decades, but by the era of Whitehall 1212, Scotland Yard had essentially enforced the exact strict protocols that Holmes had dreamed of.
They absolutely had to. A crime scene is incredibly fragile. Evidence that has become contaminated, tampered with, or mistreated can pollute the scene and cause a perfectly good case to be thrown out of a court of law. The defense barrister will tear the police apart if the evidence is tainted.
Right.
So after the scene is secured, the crime scene investigation unit performs an initial walkthrough. During this first pass, they touch absolutely nothing. They just observe to understand the broad nature of the crime. Then a second walkthrough is done for pure documentation, meticulous black and white photographs with evidence markers, and detailed hand-drawn sketches from an overhead perspective, noting specific measurements that a flat photograph might distort or miss.
Okay, but let's remember the technological limitations of the era. Alec Jeffreys didn't invent DNA profiling until 1984. When Whitehall 1212 was airing, DNA was just a theoretical concept in biology, not a forensic tool.
Completely true.
There are no CCTV cameras on every street corner in London yet. There are no cell phone towers to ping a suspect's location. There are no massive interconnected computer databases to cross-reference an alias in seconds. If they don't have a confession, how on earth were they scientifically linking a Polish Navy deserter to a bullet in Limehouse?
They relied heavily, almost entirely, on what we call trace evidence. This is based on a foundational concept in forensics known as Locard's exchange principle, formulated by Dr. Edmund Locard. The principle simply states that every contact leaves a trace. If you enter a room, you bring something with you, and you take something away.
So we're talking about the microscopic physical reality of the whirl. Footprints left in the mud, soil from a specific garden clinging to a suspect's shoe, tire tracks collected using poured bentle stone, tiny glass fragments lodged in a jacket cuff, or carpet fibers transferred during a struggle.
Exactly. And crucially, the collection of fingerprints. The use of gray or black magnetic powder to lift latent prints was a massive cornerstone of their work. The science of dactyloscopy fingerprint identification has a fascinating history. It had been pioneered back in the 1880s by figures like William James Herschel, a British administrator in India who noticed handprints on contracts, and Henry Faulds, a Scottish doctor in Japan who studied ancient fingerprints left on pottery.
That's incredible.
By the mid-20th century, Scotland Yard had a massive physical card catalog database of fingerprints and had experts who could visually match the whorls and loops with incredible accuracy. They also meticulously collected fingernail scrapings, noting the unique microscopic striations on the nails to link suspects to a struggle.
What about poisons or chemical evidence? If someone is poisoned and you don't have a mass spectrometer, how do you prove it in a 1950s lab?
That's where classical analytical chemistry came in. For example, they heavily relied on the Marsh test. This was developed way back in the 1830s, but it remained highly effective. It was designed to detect minute traces of arsenic in human tissue.
Okay, stop there. Break down the Marsh test for me. How does it actually work?
It's actually a brilliant piece of chemistry. You take a sample of the victim's tissue, say from the stomach, and you mix it with zinc and sulfuric acid in a closed glass flask. If there is even a tiny amount of arsenic present in that tissue, the chemical reaction produces a highly toxic gas called arsine gas. You then funnel that gas through a narrow glass tube and heat it with a flame.
And what happens when you heat it?
As the gas is heated, the arsenic separates out and deposits onto a cold ceramic bowl placed at the end of the tube. It forms a stark, highly visible, metallic silver-black mirror of solid arsenic. It is undeniable physical proof. You can literally walk into a courtroom, hold up the ceramic bowl with the black mirror on it, and show the jury exactly what killed the victim.
That is incredible. It takes an invisible poison hiding in the body and turns it into a physical, visible object. I've also heard they use chromatography. What is that exactly? Give me the explain it like I'm five version.
Chromatography is a method of separating a complex mixture into its original individual compounds. The simplest way to visualize it is to think of a white paper coffee filter. If you take a black ink marker and draw a dot near the bottom of the filter, and then dip just the very bottom edge of the paper into water, what happens?
The water slowly creeps up the paper, soaking it.
Right. And as the water travels up, it carries the black ink with it. But black ink isn't just one chemical, it's a mix of dyes. Because those different dye molecules have different weights and interact differently with the paper, they travel at different speeds. As the water moves up, the black dot suddenly separates into distinct horizontal bands of red, blue, and yellow ink. That is chromatography.
Ah, I see. So forensic scientists could take an unknown complex substance, say a strange liquid found in a vial near a body, or ink used to forge a questioned document, and use thin layer or paper chromatography to separate it out. They could look at the distinct bands of color and identify exactly what chemicals it was composed of.
Precisely. This was vital in determining if someone was poisoned with a specific compound or linking a specific brand of ink to a suspect's pen.
So without computers to do the thinking for them, it all fundamentally comes down to the philosophy of observation, because they couldn't just run a cotton swab through a machine and get a suspect's name printed on a screen 10 minutes later. Patience was paramount. And maintaining the strict chain of custody for all this evidence, tagging exactly who collected the charred stool, when it was placed in an evidence bag, where it was stored, and who signed it out for testing, was vital.
The chain of custody guarantees the physical and legal security of all evidence. If that chain is broken, if a single officer forgets to sign the logbook, the defense can argue the evidence was tampered with, and it becomes completely useless in court.
Wow.
Whitehall 1212 dramatized this extreme patience. It showed listeners that justice is a slow, methodical build. It's layer upon layer of mundane facts, careful interviews, and lab tests. It is not a sudden, dramatic revelation by a genius detective gathering everyone in a drawing room to point a finger at the killer.
It's the difference between a stage magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat and a master bricklayer building a structural wall. The bricklayer isn't doing anything magical or flashy. It's just mortar, brick, over and over again. But at the end of the day, you have a solid wall that you can lean your entire weight against, and it won't fall down.
That is a perfect analogy for the procedural method.
Which transitions us perfectly to the deeper underlying themes of the show. This methodical, scientific approach to solving crimes reflects a much deeper philosophical view of justice that defined post-war Britain.
If we look at London in 1951, this was a society that had just survived the most horrific trauma imaginable. They had endured the Blitz, years of strict rationing, the loss of a generation of young men, and immense economic hardship. Coming out of that, they deeply craved order. They craved the reassurance that their civic institutions were functioning properly and that society was stable.
Whitehall 1212 gave them exactly that psychological comfort. The police officers in this show are not rogue, anti-hero cowboys breaking the rules to get the bad guy. They aren't seeking personal emotional revenge against the criminals. They are quiet professionals bound by a strict sense of duty. They are seeking objective truth, regardless of where it leads.
And that reflects a very specific, deeply ingrained tradition in British policing, the concept of policing by consent, rooted in community trust rather than military force. The show continually reinforced the idea that the police were just ordinary, hardworking people doing an incredibly difficult, often grim job with quiet competence.
And it connects so beautifully to the broader ethos of Golden Age detective fiction. Think about the great literary detectives. G.K. Chesterton's Father Brown or Dorothy L. Sayers' Lord Peter Wimsey. The detectives in Whitehall 1212, much like Father Brown, understand a core, profound truth about their profession. Identifying the physical clues, the fingerprint, the burnt stool, the bullet, is really only half the battle.
The other half, the much harder half, is understanding the human heart.
Exactly. Father Brown always solved the crime by understanding the spiritual or moral failure that led to it in the first place. He looked at the ordinary greed, the petty jealousy, the desperate fear that drives a person over the edge. The detectives on Whitehall 1212 are examining physical trace evidence, yes, but they're ultimately uncovering the very ordinary human failings that lead to murder. It's the profound difference between merely solving a crime, putting a name to a deed, and actually understanding why the crime happened.
And because it managed to capture that balance, the clinical science paired with the profound understanding of human tragedy, the legacy of Whitehall 1212 is massive. By explicitly rejecting the theatrical sensationalism of shows like The Black Museum and embracing the unvarnished step-by-step reality of a genuine investigation, Whitehall 1212 helped establish the pure police procedural format.
Long before television shows popularized the genre, this radio program proved that audiences were smart enough to trust and eagerly consume methodical, slow-burn investigations, as long as they were delivered with absolute authenticity. Think about it. Every modern investigative podcast you listen to, every true crime documentary that spends an hour focusing on the slow unraveling of forensic evidence owes a creative debt to the format Wyllis Cooper and Percy Hoskins pioneered.
They proved to the networks that the truth, even when it's agonizingly slow, even when it involves nothing more spectacular than a charred piece of wood or a single indestructible tooth, is incredibly compelling on its own merits. It doesn't need to be dressed up.
So as we wrap up our time looking at these files today, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. The real Black Museum in the basement of Scotland Yard, as we established earlier, was strictly a private classroom. It was meant only to train professional police officers to recognize the physical tools of criminals. It was, and still largely is, completely closed to the general public.
But the public's fascination with that locked room was so intense, so overpowering, that it spawned these massive transatlantic radio shows, countless books, and continues to be heavily referenced in pop culture today.
So what does it truly say about human nature that we, the public, are so endlessly desperate to look inside that locked room? Are we seeking reassurance that the institutions are strong, that the police can indeed catch the monsters lurking in the dark? Or are we just fundamentally, unavoidably fascinated by the monsters themselves?
It's a question that strikes at the very heart of why we consume true crime in the first place, and it's a question every listener has to answer for themselves.
It really does. Listen to the original broadcast before hearing the discussion if you haven't already. Explore more classic detective radio on Chesterton Radio. Support the mission of preserving classic radio. Join Chesterton Radio World for exclusive podcasts, articles, stories, and behind-the-scenes content. Subscribe, leave a review, and share the episode with fellow mystery lovers.